My executioner just made a grammatical error that ruined his life. Alpha Ezra stood over me with the dagger, ready to banish me to the wasteland. He meant to scream sever, but he stumbled. He said bind. The sky didn't open with rain. It cracked open with mating lightning. And just like that, the king who wanted me dead became my soulmate.
Chapter 1. Sulfur coated his tongue like oil. Thick, gritty, vile. Ezra gripped the stone railing of the Alpha Tower, his fingers digging into the masonry until the rough granite bit back. Below him, the packed lands stretched out like a sepia nightmare. The earth was a spiderweb of cracks, gasping for rain that hadn't fallen in 6 months. The hot wind carried the scent of dry rot and desperation. It stung his eyes. Failure. The word echoed in the hollow cavity of his chest. Ezra squeezed his eyes shut. He tried to force the frantic rhythm of his heart to slow down, but his pulse hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. In his sweating palm, he crushed a piece of parchment. It was a phonetic guide, a cheat sheet his father had left behind. Cumulus, he whispered, the word tasting like ash. Pluvia, descend. He pushed his will into the syllables. He tried to sound like a king. But the ancient tongue didn't care about titles. It cared about the shape of the sound, the precise curvature of the vowel. And Ezra? He was fumbling in the dark. The air in front of him didn't cool, it shrieked. A vortex of yellow dust exploded in his face, hot and suffocating. Ezra choked. He coughed violently as the rotten egg stench of sulfur filled his lungs. Below in the courtyard, a group of pups playing in the dirt began to wheeze, their mothers snatching them up with wide, terrified eyes. They didn't see an alpha leading them. They saw a curse standing on a balcony. Damn it. Ezra hurled the crumpled paper against the wall. Weak, his inner wolf snarled, pacing restlessly in the back of his mind. Paper magic. False alpha. Ezra raked a hand through his hair, his claws threatening to extend. That was the secret that ate him alive every night. His father had been a storm caller, a legend who could summon thunder with a whisper. Ezra was just a man in a wolf's skin, pretending he could speak to gods. Alpha? The voice was soft, hesitant. Ezra spun around. His beta, Marcus, stood in the doorway. The scent of exhaustion rolled off him, stale sweat and old fear. Marcus's skin was pulled tight over his cheekbones, his eyes sunken and hollow. Report. Ezra's voice was hard, a jagged stone wall built to hide the trembling boy behind it. Marcus didn't meet his gaze. He stared at the floor tiles. The western well collapsed an hour ago. We have maybe 3 days of water left, maybe 2. 2 days. The weight of the crown slammed down on Ezra's vertebrae, heavy enough to snap his neck. 2 days before the dehydration madness set in. 2 days before the council realized their alpha was powerless to save them. The council is gathering at the sacred stone. Marcus kept his voice low. They say it's time for the rite of exile. The gods demand a sacrifice to purge the bad air. Ezra turned back to the balcony. He stared at the dying horizon. He loathed the rite. He hated the savagery of banishing a pack member to the Wastelands just to appease invisible spirits. But what choice remained? He couldn't summon the rain. Perhaps the blood of a scapegoat would buy what his voice could not. Who? Ezra asked. Who have they chosen? The mute girl, the one they call the pack ghost, Freya. A strange sensation rippled down Ezra's spine, a prickle of static electricity, like the air before a lightning strike. A warning? Or just the bitter taste of guilt? He shoved the feeling down into the dark. Make it ready. His voice was flat, dead. If the gods want a life, I will give them one. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling.
It wasn't a sound. It was a fracture. The air pressure in the scullery dropped so sharply it popped Freya's ears. She dropped her scrub brush. Soapy water splashed onto her knees. Her hands flew to her head, pressing hard against the ragged fabric of her scarf as a wave of nausea rolled through her gut. Wrong. It was all wrong. High above in the tower, someone had tried to speak the word for water, but they had mangled the inflection. They had twisted the vowel until it screamed. Instead of a smooth, cooling melody, the magic had turned into a jagged, sickly static that scratched at the inside of her skull. Freya squeezed her eyes shut. She fought the urge to retch. She knew she should keep scrubbing. She was a servant, an omega, a nobody. She was the pack ghost, seen, ignored, and silent. Silence was her shield. Silence was survival, but the noise... It was an itch she couldn't scratch, a picture frame hanging crooked on the wall of the universe. The grammar of reality was broken. Without thinking, she opened her mouth. She didn't speak. Speaking was dangerous. Instead, she hummed. She found the counter note, the low vibrating frequency that would smooth out the jagged syntax upstairs. She let the sound ripple from her throat, soft and golden. Thrum. The relief was instantaneous. The air in the scullery settled. The dust motes that had been swirling in chaotic patterns suddenly slowed, drifting down to the floor in perfect, orderly lines. The headache vanished. The world felt correct again. Freya let out a shaky breath, the scent of lye soap and damp stone filling her nose. She reached for her brush. So it is true. Freya froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. She turned slowly. The heavy wooden door had swung open. The head housekeeper stood there, flanked by 2 large guards. The scent of aggression, sharp and metallic, poured off them. The housekeeper looked at the settled dust, then at Freya. "You really are a curse," the woman spat. "Humming while the pack starves?" Freya shook her head frantically. She raised her dripping hands to sign. No, I was fixing it. I was helping. But they didn't look at her hands. They didn't care. "Get her up." Before Freya could scramble back, the guards lunged. Their grip was bruising, fingers digging into her biceps like iron bands. Freya opened her mouth to scream, but the sound died in her throat. It always did. Her voice locked up, trapped behind a wall of trauma she had built when she was 5 years old. "Don't fight it, ghost," one of the guards muttered, dragging her across the wet stone. "The council picked you. You're the offering." Offering? Her blood turned to ice. The right. They blamed the drought on bad luck, on impurities in the pack. And who was more impure than the girl with no family? The girl with no voice? Freya dug her heels into the floor. Her boots slid uselessly. "I'm not a curse," her mind screamed. "I understand the ancient tongue better than the Alpha does. If you kill me, who will fix the sky?" But the words remained trapped inside, burning her lungs. They hauled her out into the blinding, yellow sun. The heat hit her like a physical blow. She looked up at the Alpha Tower, shielding her eyes against the glare. A figure stood on the balcony. Alpha Ezra. He was looking down at her, and for a split second, the world narrowed. She didn't just see him. She felt him. A wave of crushing, suffocating shame washed over her, so intense it nearly buckled her knees. It wasn't her shame. It was his.
Heat radiated off the red earth, shimmering in waves that turned the horizon into a fluid, sickly mirage. Ezra walked at the head of the procession. The dry grit crunched under his boots. Behind him, the ceremonial drums beat a slow, mournful rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like the heartbeat of a dying animal. The entire pack followed in his wake. They were silent, desperate shadows walking toward the sacred stone. Ezra kept his eyes forward. He refused to look at the girl being dragged in chains 20 paces behind him. But he couldn't ignore her. That was the terrifying part. Ever since the guards had dragged her from the kitchens, Ezra had felt a buzzing. It was like a mosquito trapped inside his skull, a persistent static that vibrated against his teeth. Every time he glanced back at the girl, Freya, the buzzing spiked louder. It was annoying. It made his skin itch. He convinced himself it was hatred. She is the problem, he told himself, wiping sweat from his brow. She is the dissonance, the reason my magic fails. It was easier to blame the girl in rags than to blame the hollowness in his own soul. Alpha. Elder Marcus limped beside him, whispering. Remember the words? The banishment spell must be precise. I know the words. Ezra patted the pocket of his vest, where the phonetic guide sat, the paper damp with his sweat. Sever the bond, cast out the blight. Simple. They reached the sacred stone. It was a massive slab of obsidian, humming with old, dormant power. The rock was so hot it radiated heat like a furnace, smelling of ozone and baked minerals. The guards threw Freya down at the base of the altar. Ezra finally looked at her. Really looked at her. She was small, too small to hold so much blame. Her clothes were gray rags that hung off her gaunt frame, but her eyes were startling. Amber, intelligent. She wasn't crying. She was staring at him with a piercing intensity that made his wolf pace nervously inside his chest. Why? Isn't she begging? The wolf growled. Why isn't she screaming? She looked disappointed. Stand back. Ezra's voice boomed over the crowd, unnaturally loud in the still air. He stepped up to the altar, needing to be strong, needing to be the alpha they thought he was. He drew the ceremonial dagger. It wasn't for killing, not yet. It was to draw the runic lines in the air. People of the Stone Shadow Pack, Ezra yelled. Today, we cleanse our home. Today, we cut away the rot so the rain may return. A weak cheer went up from the crowd. It sounded more like a plea for mercy. Ezra turned to Freya. The buzzing in his head spiked into a high-pitched whine. He winced, his hands shaking violently. Get out of my head. He pushed the thought at her. Freya didn't blink. She just watched his mouth, her gaze locked on his lips. Ezra raised the dagger. He took a jagged breath, the taste of dust coating his throat. He prepared to speak the ancient words. The sky above them began to shift. But it didn't turn the slate gray of rain clouds. It turned a sickly, vibrant green. The wind picked up. It swirled the dust into a frenzy that stung his cheeks. Something was wrong. The energy at the stone wasn't accepting his authority. It was challenging it. Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He scrambled for the cheat sheet in his mind. Sundor. That was the word for sever. Sundor. He opened his mouth. I command the sky. Ezra began, his voice straining against the rising wind. To. He looked at Freya. Her lips parted. She looked terrified. Not for herself. For him. Green lightning began to crackle around the stone, arcing aggressively toward his boots. It wasn't waiting for him to finish. It was hungry. And in that moment, as the static screamed in his ears, Ezra realized he had no idea what he was doing.
The sky didn't just turn green, it screamed. Freya knelt in the dirt, grit bit into her knees. The air pressure around the sacred stone plummeted, heavy enough to pop her eardrums. A hot wind whipped her scarf across her face and stung her eyes. She didn't blink. She couldn't. Her entire world had narrowed to the terrifying shape of Ezra's mouth. He was going to kill them all. Not on purpose. She could smell the sour tang of his fear from 20 feet away. She could see the sweat sliding down his temple as his knuckles turned white around the dagger. But intent didn't matter to the ancient tongue. Grammar did. Ezra raised the blade higher, his chest heaving. He took a jagged breath, ready to shout the banishment command. "I invoke the storm!" Ezra roared, his voice cracking under the strain. "I command the rot to... Son..." Freya's blood turned to ice in her veins. "Number." He was using the imperative mood. He was trying to order the magic like a soldier barking at a dog, but the banishment spell required the subjunctive mood. It had to be a request, a yielding. If he used the hard sun door with that much raw, desperate energy behind it, the spell wouldn't sever her from the pack. It would sever the atmosphere. It would crack the tectonic plate beneath their feet like a porcelain plate. Without thinking, Freya lunged forward against her chains. The metal bit into her wrists. "Don't!" She tried to scream, but only a rasping croak escaped her damaged throat. Ezra didn't hear her. He was locked in his own panic, his eyes squeezed shut, bracing for the recoil. "Son..." He's going to say it. He's going to break the world. In that moment, fear vanished. A strange cold clarity washed over Freya. She couldn't let the syntax be broken. It was an offense against the universe. She scrambled to her knees, ignoring the guards who grabbed at her shoulders. She projected her thoughts, her will, everything. She was at the Alpha. She didn't shout. She whispered. But in the magical vacuum of the storm, her whisper was louder than thunder. Bind. She breathed the word, correcting the verb. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was instinct. The words for sever and bind were twins in the ancient tongue, separated only by a breath, by a softer vowel. Ezra hesitated. Just for a split second, his eyes snapped open. He heard her. He looked down, his golden gaze locking with hers. The static buzzing in his head must have stopped, replaced by the clear, bell-like tone of her correction. But it was too late to stop the momentum. The avalanche had already started. His lips moved. He tried to finish his word, but her whisper had infected his mind. He didn't say, "Sundor." He stumbled. He mixed his command with her correction. "Soon, bind." The word left his mouth. It wasn't a sound. It was a detonation.
The world dissolved into white. Ezra felt a sensation like a sledgehammer slamming into the center of his chest. He was thrown backward. He hit the dirt hard. The air knocked out of his lungs in a wheezing gasp. Did I do it? Is she gone? He rolled onto his back, blinking against the spots dancing in his vision. He expected to see rain. He expected to see the gray, heavy clouds of salvation. Instead, he saw gold. Arcs of golden lightning danced across his skin, crackling with a sound like dry wood snapping. They weren't burning him. They were sinking into him. Panic clawed at his throat. He tore his ceremonial vest open. There, right over his heart, a rune was searing itself into his flesh. It glowed with a pulsing, terrifying heat. What? He choked the word out. He looked up. Across the stone circle, the girl, Freya, was on the ground too. She was clutching her throat. Golden light poured from between her fingers like liquid sun. The lightning arced between them. A thick, crackling tether of pure energy connected his chest to her neck. It hummed with a low, vibrating power that rattled his teeth. "Kill her!" The head elder screamed from the edge of the circle, his voice shrill with terror. "The witch attacked the Alpha. Kill her now!" A guard drew his sword. The steel rasped against the scabbard. He stepped toward Freya, raising the blade to strike. Ezra saw the steel flash in the sun. No, it wasn't a thought. It was a physical compulsion, a primal veto. As the guard swung the sword down, Ezra felt a phantom blade slice into his own neck. Pain, sharp, blinding, and visceral, exploded in his throat. He gagged, clutching his neck, tasting copper blood that wasn't there. "Stop!" But it wasn't just a shout. He threw his hand out. A blast of that strange, golden lightning erupted from his palm. It hit the guard in the chest with the force of a cannonball, throwing the man 20 feet backward into the dust. Silence fell over the crowd. Absolute terrified silence. The only sound was Ezra's ragged breathing and the crackle of the fading energy. Ezra lay panting in the dirt. The pain in his throat faded as the guard lowered his weapon. He looked at Freya. She was staring at him, wide-eyed, her hand still covering the glowing mark on her neck. She was alive. And because she was alive, he was alive. Elder Marcus stepped forward, his face the color of old ash. He looked at the golden tether fading between them, then at the sky, which was slowly returning to its dusty, drought-stricken gray. "Alpha," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. "You didn't cast the exile." Ezra pulled himself up to his knees. He felt sick. He felt violated. He felt a heartbeat thrumming in his ears that wasn't his own. "What did I do?" His voice was rough as gravel. Marcus pointed a shaking finger at the rune burning on Ezra's chest. "You invoked the old law. That isn't a curse mark, Ezra. That is mating lightning. You didn't banish her. You soul-bound her." Ezra stared at the girl, the servant, the mute, the nobody, his soulmate. Chaos reigned. The pack house was in an uproar. The council was shouting in the war room, their voices echoing down the stone corridors like angry hornets. Ezra couldn't listen to them. He paced his private study, a crystal glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't drink it. He just gripped the heavy glass until it threatened to shatter in his fist. Bound. He looked at the mirror. The rune on his chest had faded to a dull, angry red scar. But the feeling remained. It was a physical weight, like a fishhook caught in his lung. Every time the girl moved, he felt a tug. Every time she felt a spike of fear, his stomach knotted. And right now, she was terrified. He could feel her fear like a cold draft sweeping through the room. She was somewhere in the dungeons. Holding cells, they called them. The council had dragged her there while they debated how to undo the mistake. "We have to kill her, Alpha." Elder Thomas had said it casually, spitting on the floor. "It's the only way to break the bond before it solidifies. She tricked you. She twisted your words." Ezra slammed the glass down on his desk. Liquor sloshed onto the wood. "She tricked me. Or did I fail so spectacularly that the universe decided to punish me?" Suddenly, a sharp pain stabbed his left wrist. Ezra hissed, grabbing his arm. There was no wound, but it stung like a fresh burn. They're hurting her. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The council wasn't waiting for his permission. They were interrogating her. Damn them. The growl ripped from his chest. Mine. His wolf snarled, pacing in the darkness of his mind. Protect what is mine. He didn't want this. He didn't want her. He despised her. She was a living reminder of his humiliation. But if she died, the feedback from the bond might kill him. Or worse, it might leave him a husk, stripped of his alpha spark. He ripped the door open. "Guards!" 2 sentries straightened up outside his door, their armor clinking. "Go to the cells." Ezra's voice left no room for argument. "Get the girl. Bring her here." The guards blinked. "Here, Alpha? To your private quarters?" Did I stutter? Ezra stepped forward, his golden eyes flashing. The shadow of the wolf rose up behind his pupils, primal and dangerous. "If anyone touches her again, if she gets so much as a paper cut, I will take it out of your hides. Do you understand?" "Yes, Alpha." They scrambled away, boots pounding on the stone. Ezra slammed the door shut and leaned his back against it. He ran a hand through his hair. He was shaking. This was a disaster. He had to protect the enemy just to keep his own heart beating. He looked around his room, the velvet drapes, the soft rugs, the piles of books he couldn't understand. Soon, she would be here, in his space, in his sanctuary. He felt a spike of emotion from the bond. It wasn't fear this time. It was confusion. And underneath that, relief. She knew he had sent for her. Ezra squeezed his eyes, shut. "Don't get comfortable, little ghost," he whispered to the empty room. "This isn't a rescue. It's a prison transfer." But deep down, as the bond hummed a low, steady note in his chest, he wondered who was really the prisoner. Here is the rewrite of Act 3, strictly adhering to your diamond rules of retention.
The latch clicked shut. Silence sealed the room like a tomb. Freya stood in the center of the cavernous study, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird hurling itself against a cage. The air smelled of old leather, dried ink, and the sharp, metallic tang of Ezra's frustration. She wrapped her arms around herself. She shivered despite the stifling heat. The silk robe they had forced her into felt alien against her skin. Too soft, too clean. It slipped over her scars like water. It didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a shroud. Still, she couldn't keep her eyes on the floor. An invisible string pulled her gaze to the shelves. They stretched from floor to ceiling, groaning under the weight of scrolls, books, and stone tablets. It should have been a sanctuary of power. Instead, it was a graveyard of grammar. Freya winced. A physical ache bloomed behind her eyes. The organization was a catastrophe. Scrolls on fire summoning were shoved next to water purification simply because both had red bindings. It was chaos. It was like putting a noun next to a verb without a subject, a sentence that couldn't breathe. It made her fingers itch. She knew she shouldn't touch anything. She was a prisoner here, a pet ghost locked in a tower. Yet the compulsion was stronger than the fear. Freya reached out. Her fingers brushed the spine of a heavy, leather-bound tome, the syntax of storms. It was upside down. Without thinking, she pulled it off the shelf. Dust coated her fingertips, dry and gritty. She moved the book 3 shelves down, slotting it next to wind currents and vowel sounds. The click of the book sliding into place felt like a bone snapping back into its socket. Better. She moved to the next one, and the next. Soon she was moving in a blur. The fear receded, replaced by the comforting, mathematical logic of the ancient tongue. She wasn't just cleaning. She was healing the sentences. She was fixing the room's broken voice. She didn't hear the heavy oak door open. She didn't hear anything until a heavy boot struck the floorboards directly behind her. "What do you think you are doing?" Freya froze. The book in her hand slipped from her nerveless fingers. It hit the floor with a deafening thud that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. She spun around. Her breath hitched. Alpha Ezra stood there. He was still wearing his ceremonial vest, but it was unbuttoned, revealing the angry red burn of the rune on his chest. His golden eyes were narrowed to slits. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who had just found a rat in his bed. Freya scrambled back until her spine hit the bookshelf. Her lungs seized. She waited for the shout. She waited for him to call the guards to drag her back to the cells. Instead, Ezra walked past her. He stared at the shelf she had just reorganized. He frowned, a deep line appearing between his brows. He pulled out the book she had just moved. "This doesn't go here." His voice was rough with exhaustion. "This is a wind spell. I keep the storm books on the top shelf." Freya bit her lip until she tasted copper. She should stop. She should lower her head and play the mute ghost. But then, he tried to shove the book back into the wrong slot. Her body moved on instinct. She reached out and grabbed his wrist.
The shock of her touch was electric. It wasn't just skin on skin. It was a jolt of pure, raw energy that shot up Ezra's arm and slammed into the rune on his chest. He gasped. The book slipped from his fingers. He stared at her hand on his wrist. Her fingers were small, calloused from years of scrubbing floors, but her grip was iron. "Let go." The growl vibrated in his chest, but he didn't pull away. Freya looked at him. Her eyes were wide, amber pools of terror. But she shook her head. She pulled his hand down. She took the book from him and placed it back exactly where she had put it. Then she pointed to the title, Wind Currents. Then she pointed to the book next to it, Cloud Formation. Ezra stared. They are related. The realization dawned slowly, whispered into the quiet room. Root verbs. She nodded. His world tilted on its axis. For years, he had been organizing his library by the color of the binding or the size of the scroll. He had been trying to brute force the magic, memorizing sounds without understanding the structure. And here was the mute girl, the pack ghost, silently correcting the alpha of the stone shadow pack in his own study. Humiliation burned in his gut, hot and acidic. It tasted like bile. You can read. It wasn't a question. Freya took a step back, her hands trembling now. She looked down, waiting for the punishment. In their world, it was treason for an Omega to learn the high language. Ezra looked at her. He looked at the disorganized mess of his life. He looked at the window where the relentless sun was baking his pack into dust. He made a choice. Pick up the quill. Freya blinked. She looked confused. I said, pick it up. Ezra pointed to his desk. If you can read, prove it. Write. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she walked to the desk. She picked up the quill, the feather trembling in her grip. She dipped it in the ink. She didn't write a plea for mercy. She didn't write her name. She wrote one word on the parchment. Listen. Ezra stared at the word. The ink was still wet, glistening black in the lamplight. Listen? He scoffed. To what? The wind? I've been shouting at the sky for 5 years, girl. It doesn't answer. Freya shook her head. She tapped the word again. Then she tapped her ear. Then she pointed at his mouth. She wrote again, You shout. Magic whispers. Ezra felt a chill run down his spine. It was the same sensation he'd felt on the balcony, the vertigo of standing on the edge of a cliff. I can't hear it. The admission cost him. It felt like pulling teeth from his own jaw. I don't have the ear for it. My father did. I don't. Freya looked at him. For the first time, the fear in her eyes softened into a strange, sad understanding. She wrote a third sentence. I can give you my ears, if you give me your shield. Ezra read it. He understood instantly. She wanted protection. She wanted the status of a highborn. She wanted him to defy the council and keep her alive. And in exchange, she would teach him how to be the alpha he was pretending to be. A bargain, Ezra murmured. He looked at the rune on his chest. It pulsed, warm and steady. A second heartbeat beneath his skin. Fine. Teach me to summon the rain, and I swear by the blood in my veins, no one will ever touch you again.
The air in the study was thick enough to chew. Freya stood behind the high-backed chair, staring at the back of Ezra's neck. He was tense, his shoulders hunched. His muscles were coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. Again. She tapped on the desk. Ezra sighed, a ragged sound. He ran a hand over his face. I'm saying it right. Pluvia. Freya rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. She grabbed the quill and scribbled aggressively on the scrap parchment. No, you were saying it like a hammer. Say it like a wave. I don't know what that means, Ezra snapped. He slammed his hand on the desk, rattling the inkwell. It's a word. A consonant is a consonant. Freya threw her hands up. She paced away from him, frustration burning in her chest. This was impossible. He was too rigid. He thought magic was a contest of strength. He thought if he just yelled loud enough, the universe would obey him out of fear. But the ancient tongue was seductive. It had to be coaxed. She turned back to him. She knew what she had to do. She was terrified to do it. Touching him earlier had sent a shockwave through her that nearly buckled her knees. The bond wasn't just a mental connection. It was a physical craving. Being this close to him was like standing next to a bonfire, dangerous, consuming heat. But they were running out of time. Freya walked back to him. She didn't write anything. Instead, she reached out. Ezra flinched as her fingers brushed his jawline. "What are you?" Freya pressed her thumb against his chin, forcing his jaw to relax. She could feel the roughness of his stubble scratching her skin. She could feel the heat radiating off him, smelling of sandalwood and storm. She moved her other hand to his throat. She placed her palm flat against his Adam's apple. His pulse was racing. Thump, thump, thump. The moment their eyes locked, the room seemed to vanish. There was only him. There was only the molten gold of his irises and the heavy, ragged sound of his breathing. Freya opened her mouth. She didn't voice the word. She just shaped it. She showed him where the tongue needed to go. Behind the teeth. Soft. Pluva. Ezra stared at her mouth. His gaze dropped to her lips. The hunger in his eyes wasn't just for magic anymore. "Mine," the look said. "Like a wave," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He mimicked her. He let his jaw go slack against her hand. He felt the vibration of her silent hum through her fingertips. "Pluvia," he murmured. It wasn't a shout. It was a caress. Freya felt the shift instantly. The air pressure in the room dropped. The static in her head cleared, resolving into a perfect, harmonious note. "Look." She pointed to the window. Ezra turned. He stood up so fast he almost knocked the heavy chair over. He rushed to the glass. Outside, in the dry, dusty courtyard, nothing was happening. The dirt was still cracked. The sky was still the color of a fresh bruise. It didn't work. Ezra's shoulders slumped. "I told you, I'm broken." Freya walked up beside him. She reached out and tapped the glass with one fingernail. Tink. Ezra froze. He leaned closer. There, on the other side of the pane, was a single perfect drop of water. It slid down the glass, leaving a clean, glittering trail through the dust. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't a flood. But it was water. Ezra turned to her. He looked stunned. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost come to life. "I did that," he breathed. Freya shook her head. She took his hand, the hand of the alpha who had tried to banish her, and placed it on the glass, right over the raindrop. She smiled. It was small, tentative, but it was real. "We did that." And for the first time in her life, the silence didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a secret they were sharing.
The silence was deafening. Ezra sat at his desk, head buried in his hands. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes until starbursts exploded in the darkness. Outside, the wind howled, sandblasting the stone walls of the tower with red dust. But inside, the noise was different. It was a phantom static, a low, terrified hum that vibrated in his teeth. It wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from her. The drought wasn't just killing the land anymore. It was killing time. 3 wells collapsed today. Marcus had reported the news that morning, his voice hollow as an empty grave. "The pups are licking the mud." Ezra looked up. Freya was across the room, curled into the stone window seat. A scroll on atmospheric pressure lay unfurled on her lap. She looked peaceful, small, harmless. Yet Ezra could feel her heart racing like a hummingbird's wings. He felt a phantom bruise throbbing on his left arm, a ghost pain in the exact spot where she had a scar from a childhood accident. He could taste the bile of her anxiety in the back of his throat, metallic and sharp. The bond was evolving. It wasn't just shared pain anymore. It was shared memory. Without warning, a vision flashed behind his eyes. He wasn't in the study. He was small. He was in a dark, cramped cupboard that smelled of cedar and mothballs. Through the wooden slats, he saw a pair of heavy boots pacing. He heard a voice His father's voice, roaring in a drunken rage. The sound of smashing furniture echoed like gunshots. Fear, pure, liquid fear, turned his bowels to water. Ezra gasped. He jolted back in his chair. The vision vanished, leaving him breathless. He stared at Freya. She hadn't looked up, but her shoulders were hunched tight to her ears. Her knuckles were white on the parchment. She wasn't reading. She was remembering. The realization hit Ezra like a physical blow. The pack ghost wasn't born mute. She had been silenced. She had hidden in the walls of this very house, while his father, the great storm caller, terrorized the pack he was supposed to protect. Ezra stood up. The chair legs scraped harshly against the stone floor. Freya! She flinched. As if pulled by an invisible string, her head snapped up. Her amber eyes were wide, glassy with the nightmare he had just intruded upon. Ezra walked toward her. He didn't march like an alpha. He moved slowly, telegraphing his movements, keeping his hands open. He stopped 3 feet away. The air between them crackled with the static of the bond, smelling of ozone. "My father," Ezra said quietly. "He did this to you, didn't he?" Freya went still. In fact, she stopped breathing entirely. "You aren't mute because of a defect." The realization settled like lead in Ezra's gut. "You're mute because he taught you that making a sound meant getting hurt." Freya lowered the scroll. Her chin trembled. She didn't write anything. She didn't sign. She just looked at him with a vulnerability that stripped him bare. He wasn't just fighting a drought. He was fighting his own bloodline. "I am not him." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, waiting for permission. "I need you to speak, Freya. Not for the spell. For us." Freya leaned into his hand. A single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek, hot and wet against his palm. "Mine to heal," his wolf murmured. But then, the door to the study rattled. Not a knock. A tremor. The magic in the room was responding to their emotional spike. The air pressure dropped so fast, his ears popped. Ezra looked at the window. The glass was vibrating in its frame. "We don't have time for fear." His voice hardened with resolve. "The wells are gone. We have to try the harmony spell. Tonight."
The air in the room tasted of copper and electricity. Freya stood in the center of the ritual circle they had chalked onto the floor. Ezra stood opposite her. They were holding hands. His palms were damp with sweat. Hers were ice cold. Between one breath and the next, the candles flickered and died. They were left illuminated only by the faint, rhythmic pulsing of the rune on Ezra's chest. "Ready?" His voice was steady, but Freya could feel the terror radiating off him through their joined palms. He wasn't afraid of the magic. He was afraid of failing her. Freya nodded. They began. "Voco ventum." Ezra spoke the first line of the invocation. "I call the wind." His pronunciation was better, smoother, but it was still lonely. The magic swirled around them, lazy and disjointed, like smoke without a fire. It lacked the anchor. It lacked the counterweight. Freya opened her mouth to form the harmony. Nothing happened. The magic stagnated. It became heavy, suffocating. The air pressure built up in the room, pressing against her eardrums until they ached. It wasn't working. The harmony spell required 2 voices, 2 vibrations, 2 souls speaking into the void. Ezra squeezed her hands until her bones ground together. "Freya." He gritted the name out, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's too heavy. I can't hold it alone." She saw the strain in the cords of his neck. The magic was crushing him. If she didn't help, the backlash would snap his mind like a twig. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was just desperation. Freya looked at the man who had started as her tormentor and ended as her student. She looked at the rune that bound them. She remembered the cupboard. She remembered the silence. In that moment, she decided that the silence was heavier than the fear. She squeezed her eyes shut. She dug her fingernails into Ezra's palms. She reached down into the deepest, darkest part of her chest, past the trauma, past the shame, and found the sound that had been hiding there. For 15 years, she didn't whisper, she sang. Et pluvia respondet, and the rain answers. Her voice was rusty, unused, and rough as gravel, but it was powerful. It hit the stagnant magic like a lit match thrown into gasoline. Instantly, the room exploded with light. It wasn't just a spell. It was a sonic boom. The windows blew out, shattering outward into the night. The heavy oak door fractured down the middle. The air turned into a vortex of wind and water vapor. But it wasn't just weather. As the truth unraveled, the bond between them ripped wide open. The sound of her voice bridged their minds completely. Freya gasped as she was blasted backward, not by wind, but by Ezra. She felt everything he had ever felt, the crushing weight of his father's expectations, the loneliness of the tower, the paralyzing fear that he was a fraud. And he felt her. He felt the cupboard. He felt the hunger. He felt the way she had loved the language of the rain because it was the only thing. That didn't lie to her. They crashed to the floor, tangled together, gasping for air. They were soaked to the bone in a sudden, localized downpour falling inside the room. Freya lay on top of him, her chest heaving against his. "You spoke," Ezra wheezed, staring up at her with awe, water dripping from his lashes. You have the voice of a queen." Freya opened her mouth to answer, to finally say yes, but a harsh sound cut through the rain. Boots, dozens of them.
The door didn't just open. It disintegrated under the force of a kick. Ezra scrambled to sit up, shielding Freya with his body. The room was a wreck. Wet scrolls were plastered to the walls. Shattered glass littered the floor. The two of them looked like they had just crawled out of a shipwreck. Without warning, the Council of Elders stormed in. They were armed. Not with ritual daggers this time, but with steel. Behind them, the Silencer, a mercenary mage known for cutting tongues, stood in the shadows, his face obscured by a hood. "Witchcraft!" Elder Thomas shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at them. "Look at this! They are drowning the tower. She has ensnared him." Freya stiffened against Ezra's chest. Her body moved on instinct, shrinking back, trying to become the ghost again. Number Ezra grabbed her hand. He pulled her up with him. He didn't let go. "Stand down." His voice was hoarse from the spell, but it carried a new weight. It wasn't the shallow bark of an insecure boy. It was the deep, resonant tone of a man who had touched the source of power. "She has ensnared nothing." Ezra's golden eyes locked onto Thomas. "She has succeeded where I failed. Look." He pointed to the floor. The water wasn't just a puddle. It was pooling, clear and sweet. "It's water," one of the younger guards whispered, lowering his sword. "Real water." "It's chaos magic," Thomas yelled, his face purple with rage. "She spoke. We heard a woman's voice. An Omega speaking the high tongue is treason. Seize her." The guards surged forward. Boots splashed in the miraculous water. Before she could move, Ezra stepped in front of her. He didn't shift into his wolf form. He didn't attack. Instead, he raised his hand. He visualized the rune Freya had taught him yesterday, the symbol for calm, the syntax of peace. He traced it in the air, leaving a faint blue trail. Sileo. A ripple of blue light expanded from his fingertips. It wasn't violent. It was like a heavy blanket falling over a drum. The effect was instant. The guards stumbled, their aggression evaporating, their swords lowered. Even Elder Thomas blinked, looking confused, his rage suddenly dampened by an overwhelming sense of lethargy. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy, a non-lethal takedown using the very magic they despised. Ezra stood tall, chest heaving, the rune burning hot under his shirt. "She is not a traitor." His voice cut through the unnatural quiet. "She is my teacher, and if you want the rain, you will let her speak." However, the victory was short-lived. From the back of the room, the silencer stepped forward. He hadn't been affected by the spell. He walked over to a wet scroll lying on the floor, one of the ones Freya had corrected. He picked it up. He read the margin notes. He looked up, and his hood fell back. His eyes were milky white, blind, but he saw everything. "That is not a teacher's script," the silencer rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on stone. Ezra stiffened. "What are you talking about?" The silencer smiled, revealing sharpened teeth. "That dialect." He pointed a long, crooked finger at Freya. "The inflection she used. That is not the language of the rain, Alpha. That is the language of the dead." As the silence roared back into the room, the elder's confusion turned to horror. "She hasn't summoned the weather," the silencer continued softly. "She has summoned the auditor." Freya gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Because of that, Ezra realized with a sickening lurch that they hadn't just broken a rule. They had broken a seal.
The study was quiet. It wasn't peaceful. The silence felt heavy, suffocating, like the air before a tornado touches down. While Ezra was downstairs in the great hall, fighting a war of words with a council he barely understood, Freya was hunting. She scrambled up the library ladder. Her fingers trembled against the wood. The silencer's words rang in her ears like a death knell, the language of the dead. She pulled down the oldest scroll she could find, a cylinder of cracked dragon hide that smelled of sulfur and dried blood. She unrolled it on the desk. The ink was faded, brown with age, but to her eyes the grammar burned bright as fire. The lie sat there on the parchment, waiting for her. For generations, the pack had been told the drought was a punishment for their sins, a lack of faith. But as Freya traced the jagged runes of the founding contract, her breath hitched in her throat. No, the whisper barely disturbed the dust. It wasn't a punishment. It was a purchase. The ancestors hadn't lost the rain. They had sold it. 300 years ago, the first Alpha had traded the tears of the sky, the rain, to the earth spirit in exchange for skin of iron, invulnerability in war. The contract was brutally clear. They got safety, the land got dry, and the lease was up. Freya scanned to the bottom of the scroll, the repayment clause. Her heart hammered against her ribs, pulled by a terrifying gravity toward the fine print. To break the contract and bring back the rain, the pack didn't need to offer a mute girl's blood. The earth spirit didn't want a scapegoat. The text read, Vox Regis Pro Aqua, the voice of the king for the water. Freya's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a cry. It wasn't a metaphor. The debt required the Alpha to sacrifice his ability to command, to speak, to lead. The door handle rattled. Freya shoved the scroll into the bodice of her dress. Rough parchment scratched her skin, a physical reminder of the doom coming for Ezra. He was down there fighting for his right to speak, unaware that his voice was the currency required to save them. She didn't know what scared her more, the fact that he would have to make the choice, or the certainty that he would do it without hesitation. She had to warn him. She had to stop him from promising anything to the council. She ran to the door. She grabbed the iron handle. It wouldn't turn. It wasn't locked. It was sealed. A line of salt and ash had been poured across the threshold, glowing with faint, malicious light. Magic. The realization hit her like a slap. She wasn't being protected in the tower. She was being contained.
The wine tasted like ash. Ezra set the heavy goblet down on the oak table with a clatter. He sat at the head of the council table, hands clasped tight to hide their shaking. He tried to project an authority he didn't feel. The silencer stood in the corner, a dark stain against the stone walls, his milky blind eyes fixed unnervingly on Ezra's throat. "The girl is dangerous, Alpha." Elder Thomas kept his voice smooth, oily. "We aren't saying she is evil. We are saying she's a vessel for chaos. The bond, it has compromised your judgment." "My judgment is fine." Ezra lied. Even so, his tongue felt heavy in his mouth, thick, swollen. "She stays." He tried to stand up. The moment his eyes locked on the door, the room tilted violently to the left. Ezra stumbled. He caught himself on the edge of the table. A wave of numbness washed over him, starting at his fingertips and racing toward his heart like ice water. It wasn't the bond. It wasn't magic. It was chemistry. "Wolfsbane." Ezra rasped, staring at the goblet. "And silverroot." He looked at Thomas. The elder wasn't smiling. He looked grim, regretful even. "It is for your own good, Ezra. The bond is a parasite. It feeds on your alpha spark. We cannot let it consume you." "Traitors." Ezra slurred. He tried to summon the lightning. He tried to call on the rune burning on his chest. But his connection to the magic was fuzzy, full of static like a radio signal lost in a storm. Without warning, the silencer stepped forward. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder. The touch was freezing. It sucked the remaining strength right out of Ezra's legs. Ezra collapsed back into his chair, paralyzed. He couldn't move his arms. He couldn't shift. He was a statue trapped in his own body, his mind screaming while his limbs refused to obey. "Bring her." The heavy doors to the great hall groaned open. 2 guards dragged Freya in. She wasn't fighting physically. She was too small for that. But her eyes were wild with terror. She saw him. She saw him slumped in the chair, head lolling, drooling slightly, utterly helpless. "Ezra." Her voice screamed in his head through the bond, sharp as a knife. "It's a trap. The debt. It's you." He heard her. He couldn't answer. He couldn't warn her. "Don't." Ezra tried to force the word out, but only a wet choke escaped his lips. To make things worse, Thomas pulled out a knife. It was made of obsidian glass, black, jagged, and cruel. "We don't want to kill you, Alpha." Thomas walked toward Freya. "We just need to cut the cord." He nodded to the guards. They forced Freya to her knees on the hard stone. Ezra's vision blurred. The rage that rose in him was volcanic, molten and consuming, but it had nowhere to go. He was trapped in a prison of flesh. As if fate demanded it, the silencer leaned down and whispered in Ezra's ear, his breath smelling of decay. "Watch closely, boy. This is how you silence a ghost."
Cold stone bit into her knees. Freya looked up at the council members circling her. They were chanting, a low discordant drone that sounded like angry bees in a jar. It was a severing shanty, ugly, dissonant magic designed to rip things apart. She looked at Ezra. He was slumped in the chair 10 feet away, his golden eyes wide with panic. He was fighting the paralysis, veins bulging in his neck, but he couldn't move a muscle. My fault, she thought, tears burning her eyes. This is all my fault. Elder Thomas stood over her with the obsidian knife. "Open your mouth." Freya shook her head violently. She clamped her lips shut. "Have it your way." Thomas grabbed her jaw. Fingers dug into her cheeks until she tasted blood. He forced her head back. He wasn't going to cut her throat. He was aiming for the rune on her neck, the anchor point. As the blade descended, the chanting grew louder. Sundor, Sundor, Sundor. The air pressure dropped. The bond between her and Ezra began to vibrate. It hurt. It felt like being stretched on a rack, physically tearing their souls apart. No matter how hard she tried, Freya couldn't break Thomas's grip, but she could hear the flaw in their chant. They were chanting in a minor key. They were using fear as the fuel. The space between them burned with the potential for counter-magic. Freya realized she didn't need her hands. She didn't even need her voice. She just needed the vibration. She started to hum. It was a guttural, throaty sound deep in her chest. She matched the pitch of their chant perfectly. And then she shifted it. She introduced a dissonant interval, a musical tritone, the devil's interval. Zet. The effect was immediate. The elder's knife hand jerked violently. The chanting faltered. The magic in the room destabilized, unable to hold the structure of the spell against her sonic interference. "She's jamming the frequency," the silencer hissed, covering his ears. "Gag her!" Thomas shoved a heavy iron gag into her mouth, stifling the hum. He buckled it tight behind her head, pinching her skin. The taste of rust filled her mouth, bitter and cold. The silence returned. The severing magic surged back, stronger and hungrier than before. Freya's eyes met Ezra's. "I'm sorry," she projected the thought at him. "I tried." Thomas raised the knife again. This time there was no hum to stop him. He brought the blade down. It slashed across the rune on her neck. It didn't just cut skin. It cut light. A blinding flash of white energy exploded from Freya's throat. It knocked Thomas backward off his feet. But then, across the room, the paralysis broke. Not because the drug wore off, but because the pain of the knife hitting Freya was transmitted instantly, amplified 1,000 times, into Ezra's body. It burned the poison right out of his blood like a forest fire. Ezra threw his head back, and he screamed. It wasn't human. It wasn't wolf. It was the sound of a mountain cracking in half.
The scream didn't end. In fact, it transformed. As the pain of the knife slicing Freya's neck flooded the bond, it burned through the wolfsbane in Ezra's blood like concentrated acid. The paralysis didn't fade slowly. It shattered like glass under a hammer. Ezra exploded from the chair. Wood splinters flew like shrapnel. He didn't shift into a wolf. He shifted into something else. Without warning, shadows erupted from his skin, swirling with the same golden lightning that had bound him to Freya. His bones cracked and reshaped, a sickening, wet sound, not into the familiar form of a canine, but into a creature of pure, jagged vengeance. He was larger, darker, a storm-given flesh, smelling of ozone and charred meat. "Where is she?" The roar didn't move his mouth. The voice came from the air itself, vibrating in the stones of the wall. Elder Thomas scrambled back. He dropped the obsidian knife with a clatter. He tripped over his own velvet robes, eyes bulging in their sockets. "The stone!" Thomas shrieked, pointing a shaking hand toward the balcony. "They took her to the stone to finish it." Ezra didn't waste time killing him. He didn't have time. As if the world narrowed to a single bleeding point, Ezra looked at the open balcony doors. The sacred stone was a mile away. Too far to run. Even for a wolf, it would take minutes. Freya didn't have minutes. He could feel her life force flickering like a candle in a hurricane, cold, weak, and fading. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was the forbidden magic of the bond rewriting his DNA. But Ezra felt a pull, a tear in the fabric of space. He didn't run. He stepped through. He lunged at the shadows in the corner of the room. Instead of hitting the stone wall, he dissolved into the dark. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. 1 second, he was in the great hall, smelling the stale wine and sour fear. The next, he was reforming in the open air, high above the packlands, plummeting toward the altar like a stone dropped from heaven. The wind whipped against his fur, freezing and harsh. Below him, the scene was a nightmare painted in red and black. The silencer was there. He was forcing Freya's head down onto the obsidian slab. Ezra didn't growl. He fell like a meteor. With every heartbeat, gravity pulled him faster. He gathered the lightning in his claws, the energy humming against his bones. He was going to turn the silencer into ash. But as he fell, he saw the sky. It wasn't gray anymore. It wasn't blue. It was black. And it was burning.
The knife had missed the artery, but it had hit the truth. Freya lay pinned against the freezing stone of the altar. The iron gag cut into the corners of her mouth until she tasted rust. Blood trickled down her neck, hot and sticky, pooling in the hollow of her throat. But the pain was distant, muted by shock. What's worse was the sky. When the blade had cut the rune, it hadn't severed the bond. It had insulted it. The atmosphere, sensitive to the ancient tongue, was reacting to the assault on its translator. As the sky darkened, the clouds didn't open with water. They opened with fire. "Look!" one of the guards screamed, his voice cracking as he dropped his spear. Freya turned her head against the stone. Sparks were falling from the heavens like snow. Dry burning embers hissed as they landed on the parched earth. Instantly, the dead grass ignited in a wall of orange flame. The drought wasn't breaking, it was escalating. The world was catching fire. Because of that, the silencer panicked. "Finish it," he yelled at the guards, shielding his face from the heat. "Kill the vessel. The magic is leaking." He raised a heavy iron mace, aiming for her skull. Freya couldn't scream. The gag choked her, filling her mouth with iron. She couldn't hum. She could only watch the spiked weapon rise against the burning sky. Time stood still. The smell of smoke filled her nose. She closed her eyes. She reached for Ezra through the fraying, burning bond. "I'm sorry." She projected the thought into the dark. "I couldn't pay the debt." Boom! Thunder shook the ground so hard her teeth rattled. But it wasn't the sky. Something massive slammed into the earth between her and the silencer. A shockwave of dust and lightning exploded outward, knocking the guards flat on their backs. Freya opened her eyes. A creature of shadow and gold stood over her. It was terrifying. It was monstrous. It was him. Ezra snarled, a sound like grinding rocks, and swiped a claw at the silencer. The mage threw up a shimmering shield, but Ezra's strike shattered it like glass. The impact sent the man flying into the burning brush with a sickening crunch. But then Ezra stumbled. The teleportation had cost him. He collapsed onto one knee, his shadow form flickering and dissolving, revealing the human man beneath. He was bleeding from his nose and ears, red tracks on pale skin. The magic was eating him alive. He looked at her. His eyes were human, terrified. He reached for the buckles of her gag. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't undo the latch. His fingers were slick with his own blood. Freya. The name was a broken prayer. As the silence roared around them, the fire closed in, crackling and popping. The council guards were regrouping, circling them with spears raised. They were trapped in a ring of steel and flame. Ezra couldn't fight them all. Not like this.
He couldn't get the gag off. Ezra's fingers were slick with sweat and blood, slipping uselessly against the cold metal. The iron buckle was jammed tight. To make things worse, the silencer was getting back up. The mage wiped blood from his mouth, his milky blind eyes glowing with malice. "You cannot save her, Alpha." The silencer's rasp cut through the roar of the fire. "She is the anomaly. The fire stops when she dies." Ezra stood up. His legs trembled. He shielded Freya with his body. He was exhausted, hollowed out. His energy reserves were gone. He couldn't shift again. He couldn't summon the lightning. He looked at the circle of guards. There were 20 of them, their spears glinting in the firelight. He looked at Freya. She was staring at him, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust and soot on her face. Her eyes were pleading. Not for her life, for his. She knows. A cold weight settled in his gut. She knows the only way out. The scroll she had found. Vox Regis Pro, Aqua. The voice of the king for the water. But it wasn't just about the rain anymore. It was about the gag, The lock on the gag was magical. It required a command word to open, a command word spoken with absolute, crushing authority. An authority he didn't have enough magic left to fuel, unless he used his life source, unless he paid the ultimate price. Between one breath and the next, Ezra made his choice. He turned to the silencer. "You want silence?" Ezra whispered, his voice rough with smoke. "I will give you silence." He looked down at Freya. He touched her cheek one last time, memorizing the warmth of her skin under the grime. "Speak for me." He turned to the lock. He gathered every ounce of his alpha voice, the voice that could command armies, the voice that defined him, the voice he had used to rule. Without another word, he opened his mouth and spoke the forbidden syntax. Vox nullius. Voice of no one. It wasn't a shout. It was a tear in reality. The sound shredded his vocal cords. He felt them snap, a hot, wet pop deep in his throat. Blood sprayed from his lips, splattering the stone. But the power of the word hit the iron gag. Ping. The lock shattered. The heavy iron fell away from Freya's face, clattering onto the obsidian. Ezra didn't hear it hit the ground. The world spun violently. Darkness encroached on the edges of his vision. He fell to his knees, clutching his throat, coughing up bright red blood. He opened his mouth to say her name, but nothing came out. Only silence. And she let it happen. Freya scrambled up. She didn't run. She stood over his fallen body like a statue carved from grief. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the smoke and the ash. The silencer laughed, a high, triumphant sound. He broke himself. Kill them both. Freya turned to face them. She opened her mouth. And this time, nothing was stopping her.
Silence followed the snap of his neck. Freya stood over Ezra's crumpled body. The smell of his blood, copper and ozone, mixed with the choking smoke of the burning world, creating a metallic tang on her tongue. He was breathing, but it was ragged, a wet rasp that tore at her heart. He had broken his own throat to free her. Her chest ached with a grief so sharp it threatened to double her over, a physical blow to the ribs. But she couldn't grieve. Not yet. "Kill her!" The silencer screamed, pointing his spiked mace at her chest. "She is undefended." The guards surged forward, their spears lowered, forming a wall of steel death. They were 10 feet away. 5. The heat of the approaching fire licked at her back. Before the words left her lips, Freya realized something. Ezra had given his voice for the water, but he hadn't given it to the earth spirit. He had given it to the lock, which meant the voice of the king was still up for grabs, and she was the one holding the leash. Freya didn't shrink back. She didn't hum. She planted her feet firmly in the hot ash. She drew breath into lungs that had been silent for 15 years, filling them with the power of the burning air. She visualized the Alpha command, that specific crushing frequency she had heard Ezra use 100 times. She opened her mouth. Kneel. It wasn't a woman's voice. It wasn't a scream. It was an avalanche. The sound hit the guards like a physical wall. In that moment, the magic didn't care about her bloodline. It didn't care that she was a servant in rags. It cared that her grammar was perfect. She spoke with the absolute, terrifying authority of a god. As if pulled by invisible strings, 20 grown men dropped. They didn't just hesitate, they collapsed. Knees hit the dirt with bone-cracking force. Spears clattered from numb fingers. Even the silencer stumbled back, clutching his bleeding ears, blood trickling from his nose. "Impossible," he gasped, milky eyes widening in horror. You are an Omega." Freya stepped over the line of prostrate guards. Her throat burned, raw and scraping, but it was a good burn, a fire of reclamation. "I am not an Omega." Her voice rang clear and cold over the roar of the flames. "I am the editor." She looked down at Ezra. He was watching her. His eyes were half open, filled with pain, but underneath the agony, there was something else. Pride. Without warning, the fire in the sky intensified. A burning branch crashed down inches from them, sending up a shower of sparks. The command had stopped the guards, but it hadn't stopped the debt. The world was still ending.
He drowned in silence. Ezra lay in the dirt, his throat on fire. Every breath was a razor blade sliding down his windpipe. Through the haze of pain, he saw Freya standing tall, commanding his army, wielding his authority better than he ever had. He should have felt emasculated. He should have felt weak. Instead, he felt complete. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed her ankle. The skin was warm, coated in ash. He couldn't tell her what to do, but the bond was still there, pulsing faintly. It was a lifeline in the dark. The sacred stone. He projected the image into her mind, sharp and urgent. The contract. We have to rewrite it. Freya looked down. She nodded. She grabbed his arm and hauled him up. Ezra groaned, his legs shaking like newborn colts, but he leaned his weight against her. She was small, but she was solid as bedrock. Together, they limped toward the altar. The heat was unbearable. The air shimmered, warping his vision. The silencer had recovered from the shock and was scrambling up, raising his mace with a snarl. "You cannot change the old ways." The maid shrieked, charging at them. Ezra couldn't warn her. He couldn't shout, "Behind you!" Her body moved on instinct, but not her own. Ezra pushed the impulse through the bond. Duck, swing. Freya dropped. She grabbed a discarded spear from the ground and swung the haft backward, guided entirely by Ezra's tactical mind. The wood connected with the silencer's knees with a sickening crack. He went down with a howl. Ezra didn't stop. He dragged Freya toward the obsidian slab. In the span of a breath, they reached the stone. The original rune, the contract for the drought, was glowing red hot. It was angry. It knew they were there to break it. Ezra looked at Freya. He pointed to her knife. Then he pointed to his own hand. The ink. He told her silently. It needs blood. Freya hesitated, her amber eyes filled with tears. Do it. Ezra pushed the thought at her, fierce and unyielding. I have no voice. I am just the vessel now. You are the scribe. As if fate demanded it, Freya took his hand. She sliced his palm open. Ezra didn't flinch. He watched his blood well up, dark, rich, and full of the alpha magic he could no longer speak.
The blood was hot on her fingers, slick, thick. Freya pressed Ezra's bleeding palm against the burning stone. The rock hissed like a striking snake. Smoke curled up, smelling of iron and ancient, angry magic. As if the world narrowed to this single patch of obsidian, Freya focused. She had to carve the new rune over the old one. She had to change the terms of reality. The old text burned bright. Dominion over earth. Freya dipped her finger in Ezra's blood. She began to write. She didn't write dominion. She wrote the ancient symbol for symbiosis. Crack. The stone fought back. A shockwave of heat blasted up her arm. It felt like sticking her hand into a blast furnace. Freya screamed, pulling back. It won't take it. It rejects the syntax. Ezra grabbed her wrist. His grip was weak but desperate. He forced her hand back down onto the burning rock. He looked at her. His golden eyes were fierce, burning with a desperation that eclipsed the pain. Push, he mouthed silent words, forming on bloody lips. He squeezed her hand. She felt a surge of energy rush from him. Not magic, but sheer will. He was taking the feedback. He was acting as the lightning rod for the stone's rage. Freya saw the veins in his neck bulge. His skin was turning gray, his life force draining rapidly to fuel the rewrite. If I stop, he dies. The realization hit with terrifying clarity. With every heartbeat, the fire in the sky grew closer. The hem of her dress caught a spark and began to smolder. Freya gritted her teeth. She ignored the burning in her fingers. She carved the rune, symbiosis. Then she changed the payment. She crossed out blood. She wrote, voice. But she didn't stop there. She realized the contract needed a seal, a union. In the quiet that followed, a strange, pressurized silence in the eye of the firestorm, Freya looked at Ezra. It needs a binding. Her voice trembled. A true binding. She didn't wait. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a soft kiss. It was desperate. It was bloody. It was a seal stamped in the presence of the gods. She tasted the copper of his injury and the salt of her own tears. As the truth unraveled, the blood on the stone flared blindingly bright. The rune for symbiosis locked into place with a sound like a heavy door slamming shut. The red glow of the stone turned blinding white. Boom! The heat vanished. Instantly. Freya pulled back, gasping for air. Ezra slumped against the altar, unconscious, his chest barely moving. She looked up. The black clouds above them swirled. The fire stopped falling, and then a drop. Cold, wet, perfect. It hit her cheek, then another, then a deluge. The sky broke open, and for the first time in 5 years, the Packlands didn't weep dust. They wept water. The world didn't just rain. It drowned. It wasn't a gentle shower. It was a torrential release, as if the sky were weeping 5 years of withheld tears in a single breath. The water slammed into the superheated earth with a deafening hiss. Steam rose in thick white plumes that smelled of wet stone and rebirth. Dust turned instantly to mud. Ash dissolved into gray slush around her ankles. Freya gasped. She wiped the deluge from her eyes. The water soaked her dress instantly, the fabric clinging cold and heavy to her skin. But she didn't shiver. The rain was warm. It tasted like metal and life. She looked down at Ezra. He was still slumped against the altar. His chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged rhythms. The blood on his chin washed away, swirling pink into the puddles gathering around his knees. Ezra? The name caught in her raw throat. His eyelids fluttered. Lashes clumped with wet soot. He didn't speak. He couldn't, but his hand twitched in the mud. He reached for her, as if summoned by the movement. The council members who had been cowering from the fire slowly stood up. They were drenched. Their expensive velvet robes, symbols of their rigid tradition, hung heavy and shapeless on their frames. They looked small, human. The silencer lay face down in the mud, groaning, his magic shattered by the sheer purity of the atmospheric shift. Elder Thomas took a step forward, his boots squelched in the mire. He looked up at the weeping sky. He looked at the rune glowing pure white on the obsidian stone. Then he looked at the mute Alpha and the servant girl holding him upright. Without warning, Thomas fell to his knees. It wasn't a forced command this time. It wasn't magic. It was submission. The pact is rewritten. Thomas bowed his forehead to the wet earth. The water returns. One by one, the other guards and elders followed. The sound of knees hitting the mud was soft, a ripple of surrender. They weren't bowing to Ezra's title anymore. They were bowing to his sacrifice. Freya squeezed Ezra's hand, her fingers interlocking with his. He opened his eyes fully now. The golden lightning was gone from them, replaced by a soft, amber warmth. He looked at the kneeling court. Then he looked at her. He smiled. It was a broken, bloody thing, but it was the most beautiful sight she had ever beheld. In that moment, the knot of fear in Freya's chest finally loosened. The drought was over. But as the rain washed the world clean, she knew the reign of the Silent King had just begun.
Eventually, the wounds scarred over. Ezra sat on the obsidian throne, the cool, hard stone grounding him. The velvet cushions felt different against his back now. Before, they had felt like a trap, a gilded cage for a fraud. Now, they felt like a seat of judgment. He ran a hand over his throat. The skin was a road map of silver scar tissue, raised and jagged under his fingertips. The healers said his vocal cords were shredded beyond repair. He would never roar again. He would never whisper a lover's name in the dark. Good, his wolf rumbled, curled contentedly in his chest. Let them listen to the silence. The great hall was quieter than it had ever been when he had a voice. The court was packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the scent of damp fur and renewed hope. Every member of the Stone Shadow Pack was there. They were healthier now, ribs no longer showing through their coats, eyes bright with hydration. The water had returned, and with it, the game. Elder Marcus stepped forward, holding a scroll with trembling hands. Alpha. Marcus kept his eyes respectfully low. The neighboring packs have heard of the change. The Alpha of the River Claw requests a trade agreement. He asks if our terms for the water rights remain the same. Ezra didn't move. He didn't panic. The old Ezra would have sweated, terrified of saying the wrong thing, terrified of being exposed. Instead, he looked to his right. Freya sat on the arm of his throne. She wasn't wearing rags. She was wearing a gown of deep midnight blue that shimmered like a night sky, embroidered with silver thread that matched the scars on his neck. She didn't look at Ezra for permission. She didn't need to. The bond was a roaring river between their minds, constant and clear. He is greedy. Ezra projected the thought, sharp and amused. He ignored us when we were dying. Tell him the price has doubled. Freya nodded, a barely perceptible tilt of her chin. She looked at Marcus. The Alpha is pleased by the offer. Her voice was melodic and firm, echoing off the stone walls with the authority of a bell tolling. However, the value of our water has changed. Since we paid for it in blood, the River Claw will pay for it in gold, double the usual rate. A murmur rippled through the crowd, like wind through wheat. Double? It was bold. It was arrogant. It was exactly what Ezra would have said. Marcus blinked, stunned. He looked at Ezra for confirmation. Ezra simply raised a single eyebrow and tapped his index finger once on the stone armrest. Tap. The sound was small, but in the silence of the hall, it sounded like a gavel. As if the world narrowed to that single tap, the court understood. Her voice was his will. It shall be done. Marcus bowed deeply, retreating into the crowd. Ezra leaned back, the tension draining from his shoulders. He reached out and took Freya's hand. His palm still bore the angry red scar of the rewrite, the word symbiosis etched permanently into his skin. Couldn't speak. He was the most powerful wolf in the territory. And he was mute. Yet, as Freya squeezed his hand, sending a jolt of warmth straight to his heart, he had never felt more heard.
The library smelled of old parchment and fresh rain. Freya walked through the towering rows of shelves, fingers trailing over the leather spines. It was late. The moon was full, casting long, silver beams across the floorboards, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Because of that light, she could see the changes clearly. The chaos was gone. The scrolls were no longer shoved into random cubbies based on color. They were organized by root verb, by intent, by emotional weight. The fire spells sat next to the passion poems. The water histories rested beside the grief eulogies. It made sense. Finally, the grammar of the magic made sense. She heard a heavy footstep behind her. Freya turned. Ezra leaned against the doorframe, his silhouette broad and imposing. He had loosened his collar, revealing the silver scar tissue on his throat. He looked tired, the shadows deep under his eyes, but his posture was peaceful. He walked over to her, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't sign. He didn't write. He just wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her flesh against his chest. Happy? His voice echoed in her mind, clearer and more resonant than it had ever been when he spoke aloud. The library is finished. Freya rested her hands on his chest, right over the faded rune of the mating bond. She could feel his heart beating, strong, steady, and hers. I think the ancestors would be annoyed. I put the war scrolls on the bottom shelf. Ezra's chest rumbled against her palms, a silent laugh vibrating through his ribs. Good. The thought was warm with amusement. Let them gather dust. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. The contact sent a shiver of warmth cascading through her, not the violent, dangerous lightning of the beginning, but the steady, enduring heat of a hearth fire. Her soul answered the call of his proximity, humming in tune with his. Do you regret it? She asked the question softly, pulling back just enough to look into his golden eyes. Your voice? Ezra shook his head slowly. He lifted his hand, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Then he pointed to the window, where the sound of gentle, rhythmic rain drummed against the glass, a lullaby for a healing world. I didn't lose my voice. The mental tone was fierce, possessive, and overflowing with love. I just gave it to someone who knows how to use it. He kissed her. It was slow, deliberate, a conversation without words, tasting of rain and promise. As the echo of the storm faded into the night, Freya realized that the silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of rain, full of peace, and full of a language that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. Outside, the storm clouds parted, revealing a clean, washed clean moon.